Open this door right now or I'm breaking it down.
Can you first tell me what this is about?
We got a call about a disturbance. You need to step outside.
A disturbance? I'm a nurse. I worked a double shift. I've been asleep for 2 hours.
Ma'am, last warning.
The camera turns on at a private residence. A police officer tells a woman she is trespassing. The footage will later cost the city $2.7 million, not because of what happened next, but because of what never happened at all. According to the recording, the setting is unremarkable. A driveway, a mailbox, a woman standing where she belongs. The officer's assertion is immediate and definitive. She is told to leave the property. There is no visible threat, no damaged entry, no indication of urgency. The allegation stands on its own. The woman responds with a single fact. She lives there. This is where the irony locks in. The person being ordered to justify her presence is not unfamiliar with rules, procedures, or verification. She is a nurse. Her professional authority is built on confirmation before intervention, on protocols that require facts to be established before action is taken. In her work, assumptions can harm patients. Verification is not optional. None of that authority is recognized here. According to the footage, the officer does not ask how long she has lived there. He does not request verification before issuing commands. He does not consult records. He proceeds as if the allegation has already been resolved in his favor. This is a decision point. Verification is available. He chooses not to use it. The camera captures the imbalance clearly. The woman remains steady. Her statements do not change. She repeats the same fact because the fact has not changed. The officer escalates verbally, framing compliance as a prerequisite for acknowledgement. This was a decision point. Verification was available. He chose not to use it. What the audience understands immediately and what the officer does not appear to process is that this moment will not remain contained to the driveway. Court documents later show that this interaction becomes the foundation of a civil lawsuit. A jury will eventually review these minutes without urgency, without noise, and without the pressure of the moment. The outcome is not explained yet. Only its scale is signaled. A jury verdict, not a negotiated settlement, $2.7 million. At this stage, none of that has occurred. There is only an allegation made without confirmation and a refusal to pause long enough to resolve it. According to official records, no emergency existed that required immediate enforcement. No exigent circumstance compelled action before verification. The law allowed time. The officer did not take it. Each repetition tightens the posture. The allegation remains the same. No new facts are introduced, yet the pressure increases. What began as a question has become an enforcement stance without an investigative foundation. Disengagement remains possible, but it now carries a cost. Stepping back would require acknowledging that the premise was wrong. That acknowledgement does not come. This case will not turn on speculation or emotion. It will turn on sequence, on what was said before what was checked, on what could have been verified before authority was asserted. The camera records all of it, patiently, without interruption. The law will speak later. For now, the footage continues, capturing a path that narrows with every decision not to verify. According to the footage, the officer's assertion rests on a single premise, that the woman standing in front of him cannot establish a lawful right to be where she is. Everything that follows flows from that assumption. The camera, however, records a different reality. The woman identifies the location as her residence. She does not wander. She does not retreat. She remains at the threshold of her own home. Her statements are consistent. Her demeanor does not change. According to court documents, her connection to the property was lawful and valid at the time of the encounter. That fact is not disputed in later proceedings. What is disputed is why verification did not occur before escalation. In constitutional terms, this moment sits squarely within a familiar boundary. The Fourth Amendment permits brief investigative steps when reasonable suspicion exists. It does not authorize commands first and verification later without a basis that can be articulated. According to official filings, no such basis was recorded here. The officer does not cite a report of forced entry. He does not reference a complainant identifying her as unauthorized. The footage shows no damaged property, no hurried movement, no attempt to flee. This creates the legitimacy gap. On one side is the woman's lawful presence. On the other is the officer's insistence that presence must be proven under threat of enforcement. The camera captures the gap widening as time passes. The officer could request documentation calmly. He could radio dispatch. He could consult property records. Each option remains available. None are taken. This is another decision point. He continues without narrowing uncertainty. He doesn't stop. According to investigators later reviewing the footage, the woman's responses remain aligned with someone asserting a basic right rather than resisting authority. She does not obstruct. She does not interfere. She repeats the same fact. She lives there. The officer responds with directives rather than questions. The order of operations is reversed. This reversal matters because residency is not a privilege granted by police presence. It is a status established independently of the encounter. Court filings later emphasize this distinction. A person does not become a trespasser because an officer doubts them. Trespass requires lack of authorization. Here, authorization existed before the officer arrived. The camera records the moment when the officer's tone shifts. The language becomes firmer. The implications become clearer. Compliance is framed as mandatory before proof is accepted. This is another chance to de-escalate. He does not. From a legal standpoint, the situation becomes increasingly fragile. The officer's actions now depend on a theory that will later be tested in court, that suspicion alone justified continued pressure absent corroboration. According to the jury's later findings, that theory did not hold. The woman's profession becomes relevant not as a credential to demand special treatment, but as context for how she interacts with authority. Nurses operate within layered systems of consent and verification. According to court records, her work requires confirmation before intervention. That mindset is visible on the footage. She seeks acknowledgement of facts before submission to commands. She expects process. Process does not arrive. Instead, the encounter proceeds as if the burden rests entirely on her to disprove an allegation that has not been substantiated. The officer's choices reduce the available exits. He does not disengage. He does not verify. He doubles down. This was another chance to stop. He didn't. As minutes pass, the legitimacy gap becomes unmistakable. Everything the woman says aligns with lawful presence. Everything the officer does aligns with enforcement without confirmation. The camera captures the contrast without commentary. It does not editorialize. It simply records. Later, in court, this portion of the footage becomes foundational. Jurors are instructed to consider whether a reasonable officer, under similar circumstances, would have taken steps to confirm residency before escalating. According to the verdict, the answer was no. But that conclusion lies ahead. At this stage of the story, the imbalance persists unchecked. The woman remains where she belongs. The officer remains unconvinced. The law, silent but present, waits to be applied after the fact. Nothing in this exchange required force. Nothing required urgency. The only thing required was verification. It did not happen. By the time the encounter moves beyond this point, the question is no longer whether the woman had the right to be there. That question has already been answered by the facts. The question becomes why the officer chose a path that made those facts irrelevant in the moment, and how that choice would later be judged when the camera, the law, and a jury were all given time to review it. To understand why the encounter continued in the direction it did, the lens widens beyond the doorway and onto the system that shaped the officer's choices. According to departmental records referenced later in court, the officer was operating within standard patrol authority. Nothing in his assignment required immediate intervention at this address. There was no active call indicating danger. No emergency protocol was triggered. What remained was discretion. Discretion, however, does not exist in a vacuum. It is trained, it is reinforced, it is modeled by supervisors and embedded in departmental culture. According to expert testimony cited in the case, modern patrol training emphasizes control of uncertainty. When an officer does not understand a situation, the instinct is often to assert authority first and resolve ambiguity second. That instinct is visible here. From the moment the officer rejects the woman's statement of residency, the encounter enters a familiar pattern. The goal is no longer to determine what is true. The goal becomes to maintain command. Questions give way to directives. Verification gives way to compliance. This shift is subtle, but the camera records it clearly. This is another decision point. The officer could recalibrate. He could step back into an investigative posture. He does not. The department's expectations do not compel him to stop. Nothing in policy forces a pause. The path of least resistance is continuation. According to internal review documents later disclosed, the department did not have a specific protocol requiring officers to confirm property residency before issuing trespass warnings in all circumstances. The absence of a bright line rule leaves room for judgment. Here, judgment hardens instead of softening. The footage shows the officer maintaining proximity, repeating commands, and framing the situation as non-negotiable. This approach aligns with what training materials often describe as command presence. In some contexts, that presence prevents escalation. In others, it replaces inquiry. This was another chance to stop. He didn't. What matters legally is not whether the officer intended harm. The prompt forbids speculation on motive, and the record does not require it. What matters is the sequence of choices and how they align with constitutional standards. According to court documents, the department later acknowledged that alternative options were available throughout the encounter. The officer's supervisors are not present on scene. There is no immediate corrective input. Body-worn cameras are designed to create accountability after the fact, not guidance in the moment. The officer is alone with his decisions, and the system allows those decisions to stand until reviewed later. This autonomy is a double-edged sword. It enables rapid response when necessary. It also allows errors to compound when unchecked. The camera captures compounding clearly. Each instruction assumes the correctness of the previous one. Each refusal to verify reinforces the initial assumption. The logic becomes circular. According to testimony, this is where many encounters become difficult to unwind. Once an officer frames a civilian as non-compliant, stepping back can feel like loss of authority. Training often emphasizes maintaining control rather than reevaluating premises. The footage reflects that emphasis. The department's internal culture does not intervene in real time, but it will later. Investigators reviewing the case focus on whether policy allowed or discouraged the officer's approach. According to their findings, the policies neither explicitly endorsed nor prohibited the behavior. That ambiguity becomes relevant in court. At this stage, the woman's legitimacy has already been established by facts outside the officer's perception. The department context explains why those facts did not penetrate the encounter. Systems reward decisiveness. They do not always reward reconsideration. This was another chance to stop. He didn't. By the end of this segment, the encounter has moved beyond a simple misunderstanding. It has become a test case for how much discretion an officer can exercise before constitutional limits are crossed. The department will later be asked to explain how its training, policies, and oversight shaped this outcome. Those questions are not answered on the scene. They will be answered months later, through review boards, legal filings, and ultimately a jury. For now, the system remains invisible, operating quietly behind the badge, while the encounter continues to narrow toward a consequence no one on scene appears to be calculating yet. By the time the encounter reaches its next phase, the groundwork for escalation has already been laid. According to the footage, nothing materially changes in the environment. The house remains the same. The woman's position does not shift. There is no new information introduced that would heighten risk. What changes is the officer's posture toward resolution. He no longer treats the situation as one that can be clarified. He treats it as one that must be concluded. The language tightens. Commands replace statements. The officer frames compliance as the only acceptable outcome. Verification is no longer presented as a step in the process, but as a reward for submission. This is a critical decision point. Constitutional standards do not require a person to surrender basic rights in order to have facts acknowledged. The footage shows that expectation forming anyway. This was another chance to stop. He didn't. The woman responds by repeating the same core fact. She lives there. According to court documents, she does not attempt to leave because leaving would imply acceptance of an accusation that is untrue. She does not raise her voice. She does not obstruct. Her behavior remains consistent with someone asserting lawful presence rather than resisting authority. The officer interprets this consistency as defiance. At this stage, escalation becomes procedural rather than emotional. The officer invokes consequences. Warnings are issued. The possibility of detention is introduced. Each statement narrows the legal path available to him. Once threats of enforcement are articulated, retreat becomes harder to justify without acknowledging error. The footage records this narrowing in real time. Another decision point appears. The officer could pause and reassess before crossing from verbal pressure into physical enforcement. The law permits disengagement. Nothing requires immediate action. He does not pause. He continues. The camera angle shifts slightly as the officer adjusts his position. The woman remains within the boundary of her residence. The officer's presence now dominates the frame. According to later analysis presented to the jury, this shift matters. It visually reinforces who is exerting power and who is being subjected to it. The officer reiterates the allegation of trespassing. This repetition is significant. Trespass is not a flexible concept. It requires lack of authorization. According to official filings, authorization existed. The officer does not seek to confirm or disconfirm that fact. He proceeds as if it has already been resolved in his favor. This is another chance to stop. He didn't. The encounter now carries consequences beyond the moment. According to court records, the officer's statements and actions during this phase become central to the lawsuit. Jurors later focus on what a reasonable officer would have done when faced with a claim of residency that could be verified. The footage shows that verification was possible at multiple points. It did not occur. The woman's responses remain measured. She does not argue the law. She does not cite statutes. She simply asserts reality. The officer's responses grow increasingly formal, as if reciting a script designed to justify next steps. This shift signals escalation not driven by new facts, but by commitment to a course already chosen. As the interaction continues, the power dynamic becomes unmistakable. The officer controls the pace. He controls the language. He controls the potential outcomes. The woman controls only her refusal to concede something untrue. According to later testimony, this refusal is framed not as resistance, but as insistence on accuracy. The camera captures a moment where silence briefly enters the exchange. The officer waits. The woman does not move. Nothing changes. That silence is filled not with danger, but with unresolved authority. It is here that the encounter could still end without consequence. The officer could disengage. He could acknowledge uncertainty. He could verify. This was another chance to stop. He didn't. Instead, the officer resumes with renewed insistence. The escalation is now complete. The situation is transformed from a question of residence into a confrontation over compliance. According to legal analysis later presented in court, this transformation is what triggers constitutional scrutiny. Once an officer's actions are no longer tethered to a legitimate investigative purpose, continued pressure becomes unlawful. At the time, none of that analysis exists. There's only a camera recording a sequence that is becoming increasingly difficult to defend. The officer appears committed. The woman remains where she belongs. The system that will eventually judge this moment is still months away. By the end of this phase, the outcome is no longer determined by facts. It is determined by momentum. The officer has taken a series of steps that make disengagement unlikely. The woman has taken none that would justify escalation. The imbalance is complete. What happens next will not be decided on the sidewalk. It will be decided later, in rooms where this footage is paused, replayed, and examined without urgency. The silence before that examination is approaching. The investigation does not begin with interviews or conclusions. It begins with video. According to official filings, the footage becomes the primary record against which all statements are measured. There is no dispute about what the camera captured. The disagreement centers on how those moments should be interpreted under the law. Reviewers start at the beginning. They watch the officer approach. They listen to the first allegation of trespassing. They note the absence of corroborating facts. According to investigators, nothing on the footage indicates forced entry, attempted entry, or unauthorized presence. The woman's statements remain consistent throughout. The officer's assumptions do not change. Supervisors examine the decision points. Each one is time-stamped. Each one is compared to policy guidance. According to internal review summaries later referenced in court, verification options were available at multiple stages: dispatch checks, property confirmation, clarifying questions. None were used. Internal affairs becomes involved. The review expands beyond the officer's words to include posture, proximity, and sequencing. Investigators later confirmed that the officer's escalation did not follow a documented progression tied to new information. It followed repetition, the same allegation, restated with increasing authority. This is where the footage exerts its quiet force. It does not argue. It does not accuse. It simply shows. When reviewers slow the video, frame by frame, the gap between what was known and what was done becomes visible. According to court documents, this gap forms the backbone of the civil claim. Then comes the moment that shifts the case. The room is silent. The video plays without commentary. No one speaks. The officer stands still on screen. The woman stands still on screen. Nothing changes. This silence lasts only seconds, but it does something the argument could not. It removes urgency. It removes justification. It leaves only choice. When the review resumes, the analysis tightens. Investigators compare the officer's actions to constitutional standards governing investigative detention and trespass enforcement. According to expert assessments submitted later, the absence of reasonable suspicion tied to observable facts is decisive. The allegation could not stand on assertion alone. The department forwards findings up the chain. According to official records, supervisors acknowledged that the encounter presented risks that were not mitigated. The footage is preserved. Reports are finalized. Legal counsel becomes involved. What began as a routine interaction now carries institutional exposure. Parallel to the internal process, civil litigation begins to take shape. Court documents state that the woman's legal team requests all available recordings, training materials, and policy documents related to trespass enforcement. The footage is disclosed in full. There are no missing segments. There is nothing to contextualize away. During depositions, the video is replayed again. Each decision point is revisited. Each opportunity to verify is identified. According to transcripts referenced later, the officer is asked to explain why verification did not occur. The answers do not introduce new facts. They rest on judgment calls made in the moment. The investigation does not conclude with discipline at this stage. It concludes with exposure. Exposure to a legal process that will move more slowly, but with greater consequence. According to filings, the case advances to trial because the central facts are not in dispute. The dispute is about reasonableness. By the time the case reaches a courtroom, the footage has already done most of the work. Jurors will not be asked to imagine what happened. They will be shown. They will watch the same moments reviewed internally. They will see the same choices unfold without interruption. The investigation phase ends not with resolution, but with inevitability. The question is no longer whether the officer made a mistake. The question is how that mistake will be measured, and by whom. The system that deferred judgment on the scene now asserts it formally, through procedure rather than command. The camera remains the constant. It records, it waits, and when the law finally speaks, it will speak through what the camera captured. The legal consequences do not arrive suddenly. They assemble piece by piece, following the same sequence the footage established. According to court records, the case proceeds to trial because the parties do not dispute the core facts. The woman was at her residence. The officer accused her of trespassing. The interaction was recorded. What remains for the jury is judgment. The courtroom does not revisit emotion. It revisits decisions. Jurors are instructed on the standards governing investigative encounters and trespass enforcement. They are asked to consider what a reasonable officer would have done when faced with a claim of lawful residency that could be verified. According to trial transcripts, the footage is played in full, not highlights, not excerpts, the entire sequence. The prosecution does not argue intent. It does not argue character. It argues sequence. According to closing arguments summarized in the record, the case turns on the order in which things happened: accusation before verification, command before confirmation, escalation without new information. Defense counsel emphasizes discretion. Officers must make decisions quickly. Situations are fluid. According to filings, the defense argues that hesitation can create risk. The jury listens. Then they watch the footage again. The absence of urgency becomes difficult to ignore. Witnesses explain policy. Experts explain constitutional limits without legal jargon. According to expert testimony, discretion is not unlimited. It narrows as facts stabilize. Here, the facts stabilized early. The response did not. Jurors are shown each decision point, each moment where the encounter could have ended without consequence, each moment where verification was possible. The repetition matters. According to juror interviews cited later, the pattern becomes clear not through any single statement, but through accumulation. When deliberations begin, the footage goes with them. There is no dramatic announcement of wrongdoing. There is no need for one. According to the verdict form, the jury answers specific questions. Was the woman lawfully present? Yes. Did the officer have sufficient justification to continue enforcement without verification? No. Did the officer's actions violate her rights? Yes. Then comes the consequence that was teased from the beginning, the damages phase. Jurors are instructed to consider compensation, deterrence, and accountability. According to the verdict, they do not choose a symbolic amount. They choose a measured one, $2.7 million, not imposed by negotiation, not reduced by compromise, delivered by a jury after review. The number matters because of how it is reached. It reflects time spent watching footage, time spent discussing alternatives, time spent weighing authority against restraint. According to court documents, the verdict is upheld post-trial. Motions to reduce or overturn are denied. Only after the verdict does administrative action follow. According to official records, the department initiates termination proceedings. The sequence is deliberate. The legal system speaks first. The employment system responds second. This order is important. It prevents internal action from substituting for judicial accountability. The officer's status changes. The woman's status does not. She remains what she always was, a lawful resident asserting a basic right. What changes is the formal recognition of that right and the cost assigned to its violation. The department issues statements. Training reviews are announced. According to public disclosures, policies related to trespass verification are reevaluated. None of this erases the verdict. It exists independently of institutional response. In legal terms, the case becomes precedent not through published opinion, but through practice. Attorneys reference it. Departments cite it in training. Officers watch it during instruction. According to records, the footage is incorporated into educational materials, precisely because it shows how small decisions accumulate into large consequences. The verdict does not claim that officers cannot act. It demonstrates that action without foundation carries weight. The law does not punish uncertainty. It punishes refusal to resolve it when resolution is available. By the end of this phase, accountability has taken shape in its final form. A jury has spoken, a number has been attached, a career has been altered. The footage has completed its journey from recording device to legal instrument. What remains is not punishment, but impact, how this moment changes what comes next. The case does not end when the verdict is read. According to public records, its effects continue in quieter, less visible ways. Courtrooms deliver judgments. Systems absorb them. After the $2.7 million verdict, the department begins reviewing how officers are trained to handle residency disputes. Training materials are updated. Scenarios that once emphasized control are revised to emphasize verification. According to official disclosures, officers are instructed to treat claims of lawful residence as investigatory questions, not enforcement conclusions. Supervisory review protocols change as well. Body-worn camera footage involving trespass allegations is flagged for early assessment. The goal is not discipline first, but correction before patterns form. According to internal memoranda later referenced, supervisors are encouraged to intervene when footage shows escalation without new information. The footage itself becomes instructional. Recruits watch it without narration. According to training outlines, they are asked to identify the decision points where the encounter could have ended. The lesson is not about blame. It is about sequence. Verification before command. Confirmation before consequence. Civil attorneys cite the case in filings involving similar allegations, not for its facts alone, but for its clarity. The jury's reasoning is straightforward. When a person claims lawful presence and verification is available, ignoring that verification creates exposure. According to legal analyses published afterward, the case reinforces existing constitutional doctrine rather than expanding it. For the woman, the aftermath is less visible. Court documents note no further legal action. The verdict provides compensation, not restoration. What it restores is recognition. The law affirms that her insistence on accuracy was not obstruction. It was lawful. The officer's role in the system ends. According to official records, Termination follows the verdict. There is no public apology attached. There is no statement of intent. The record closes with procedural finality rather than narrative closure. What remains is the footage. It continues to exist independently of the people involved. It is shown in classrooms, referenced in briefs, and replayed in discussions about discretion and restraint. It does not argue. It does not accuse. It demonstrates. This is how systemic change usually occurs, not through declarations, but through examples that are difficult to dispute. A camera records. A jury watches. A number is assigned. Training adjusts. Policy shifts. The law does not require perfection from those who enforce it. It requires reasonableness. In this case, reasonableness was available early and ignored. The system responded late, but decisively. The footage made it undeniable.